Good afternoon, everyone. As people are loading in, we're going to start with the ULI upcoming spring meeting video advertising and upcoming conference in Toronto. Thank you. ULI Toronto prepares to welcome 4,000 international experts from across the real estate and land use industries in Toronto next May the 16th to the 18th. To learn more about the 2023 ULI Spring Meeting, the first time it's ever been in our city, the links are in the chat. We'd also like to just commend you to become a ULI member. We have now more members than ever before, and people are really discovering just how much value there is in a ULI membership. Not only are you getting discounts on our events, but you're getting access to a lot of information and resources behind our ULI paywall. So we encourage you to consider a membership. Once again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard Joy, Executive Director of ULI Toronto, and welcome to day 4 of the National Housing Week 5-part lunchtime series, Reality Check, Hits and Misses of Government-Supported Affordable Rental Housing. Before we get into this, as always, we'll begin with a land acknowledgement. As a Toronto region-based organization, we acknowledge that the land we are meeting on virtually is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, and newcomers in this generation or generations past. ULI stands in solidarity with Indigenous communities demanding action and accountability for the ongoing legacy of the residential school system. We also acknowledge and honor those who've come here involuntarily, particularly descendants from those brought here through enslavement. To better understand the meaning behind this land acknowledgement, we recommend 4 programs that we've uploaded to YouTube. These links are available in the chat. Today's event and all of the ULI program would just not be possible without ULI's annual sponsors. And we'd like to thank all of them for that support. Now, more than ever, ULI relies on the support of our sponsors to put on high quality programming to drive our mission to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact in communities worldwide. To all of our sponsors, we say thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, well known to many people in this particular space, Mark Richardson, CTO. He's with Rich Analytics, technical lead of HousingNowTO.com. Before I hand over to Mark, I just want to make one important note to our audience that ULI is a nonpartisan organization. We do not advocate on public policy, pro or con, but we do frequently take a critical look at the public policy landscape in the context of advancing our global mission. And that's what this week's all about. And so with that, Mark, again, my pleasure to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to ULI for giving me the opportunity to host this panel about a very important topic here in the city of Toronto. We're going to be talking today about government-supported affordable housing. And before we start the panel, I wanted to make sure, next slide, please, that we really all have a common understanding of exactly what part of the housing continuum or the housing spectrum in the city of Toronto we are talking about when we use the phrase government-supported affordable rental housing. This is a chart that we modified slightly from the city of Vancouver or Victoria, who created this in BC. We've adjusted it for some city of Toronto numbers, but it's the full spectrum of housing, all the way from emergency shelters and transitional housing through social housing, co-ops, purpose-built rental, affordable and below market ownership, all the way up to privately owned single-family homes and the kind of incomes that correspond with them. But also the really important part of this slide is the gray triangle, the level of government assistance that is required for each part of the housing continuum. We are now in a situation where through first-time home buyers and things, we are actually giving government assistance much farther into the market end of the housing spectrum than we were in the past. Next, please. But for the purposes of today's conversation, we're not going to talk about affordable ownership like Habitat for Humanity or Options for Homes or Trillium. We're really going to talk about this chunk in the middle here from social housing through to purpose-built market rental. And with the context that in the city of Toronto right now, based on the last census, our median total household income within the borders of the city of Toronto is $84,000 in annual income. However, we know that we're having to do housing for people from $10,000–$15,000 a year in annual income, and some of our programs now are topping $100,000 almost in order for you to qualify for a unit in some of the workforce housing spectrum. Next slide, please. So there's some examples in these slides. I'm sure ULI will circulate them. These all come from City of Toronto materials. So we just want to make sure that we're all talking the same terminology. Rent geared to income. The rent is calculated based on 30% of your household income. Could be provided by TCHC, could be provided by a co-op, could be provided by other not-for-profit housing partners. But you could see rents there as low as a few $100s a month. Well under $600 or $700 a month. In an RGI unit. But in order to get those, you're going to be on a wait list, and potentially you could be on that wait list for many, many years based on the kinds of unit you want, or the size of units you want, and the location you want to obtain it in. Whereas how the city of Toronto currently defines affordable rental housing is really targeted at a more middle income, or workforce housing is sometimes the tool that's used. And it's aiming it for people between 35,000, and when the city had this plan up to about 50 or 60,000. In reality now, because average market rents are increasing, we're now seeing that people are qualifying well into the 90,000s. But to obtain those units, when they become available, you're entered into a random draw. That draw is not really managed by the city. It's being managed by the landlord or the operator of that building. So it's kind of a disjointed system. Next slide, please. And we're just an example of that. So the early childhood educator, the construction laborer, retired pensioner, in the Toronto Housing Implementation Plan from 2020 to 2030, that was the goal about who this affordable rental or workforce housing was for. However, because average rents are increasing across the city of Toronto right now, and those housing lottery units are based on average market rent, as 80% of average market rent, we're now finding that in current lotteries, the licensed practical nurse at 51, 52,000 a year doesn't meet the income threshold to qualify for that unit. And we now have units like a 3-bedroom where the rent is up. You can qualify up to an income maximum of $94,000, $95,000. That's only going to increase those bands as the market rates increase and the market rents increase across the city. So next slide. It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce the panelists who are going to be joining us today. All of their bios are going to be put into the chat. Andrew Joyner is the Managing Director of Tricon Residential. Shi Tam is the Executive Director of the Kensington Market Land Trust. Joe Svec is the Vice President of Development and Planning for Choice Properties. Ray Sullivan is the Interim Executive Director of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. I think we have everybody. So I'm going to start this with Andrew, and I'm going to ask each of you to briefly tell us a little bit about your organization, 1 or 2 minutes, your work with creating or maintaining government-supported affordable rental housing, and some recent examples of success and the kinds of renters that your organization serves. So Andrew, I'll start with you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Joyner. I oversee Tricon Residential's Canadian purpose-built rental apartment platform here in Toronto. We're focused on the GTA. We're a develop to core operator, so we build units that we own and operate long-term. We started this business in 2016, and we're one of the first groups to enter the purpose-built rental market with scale back then. And today, we have 6,000 units under construction and operations in the city. We have partnered with the province, we have partnered with the city to build large-scale mixed-income rental communities. Very proud of those and being part of the solution, and can share some anecdotes from those today in terms of what's working well and what some of the headwinds are. And you know, the majority of what we build is market rate rental housing, but of that 6,000 units in our pipeline, 1,000 of those units are indeed affordable at a sliding scale on the AMR spectrum from 40 to 100% AMR.
Okay, thank you. And next we're going to ask Chi from the Kensington Market Land Trust to tell us a little bit about your organization and the kinds of units you manage and the kinds of rents that you service.
Happy to. So yeah, I'm the Executive Director of the Kensington Market Community Land Trust, which is a neighborhood-based, democratically owned and operated organization. So my boss is the neighborhood. And we operate with the explicit purpose of acquiring, but also developing properties with the goal of permanently removing them from the speculative market and thereby dedicating that land in trust. Thus the terminology community land trust for whatever the community benefit and need is. And so because the nature of our housing crisis is so, our focus now is largely on rental stock, both acquiring, preserving it, renewing it, and then also developing more of it. But the permanence there is kind of a distinguishing factor to our approach. And so depending on the identified need, the land trust model actually does have a mandate to lease for the wide range of that entire scale that Mark just demonstrated. But again, because of the nature of our services, we aren't able to focus on affordable homeownership, which is a very typical way that community land trusts would operate. So in some recent successes, the Kensington Market Community Land Trust particularly has very rapidly got themselves together and quickly after incorporating been able to acquire their first property. Our sister organizations through Parkdale, through Circle, and the Toronto group of community land trusts now have hundreds and hundreds of properties scattered throughout the city of Toronto. And I'll say more later about the government support that the type of government support our affordable rental housing actually is in nature. But yeah, I think we're growing incredibly rapidly and excited to see where it goes next.
Thank you. And I'm going to move next to Joe from Choice Properties. Joe?
Thanks, Mark. Hey, I'm Joe from Choice Properties. A little bit on Choice. Choice has a portfolio of about 750 properties across Canada. We're a diversified REIT between commercial, office, industrial, and res. In terms of our res portfolio, mainly focused on rental housing. In the GTA, we have about 1.3 million square feet of res GFA, about 1,600 units currently under construction, and 8 active mixed-use applications. What I just wanted to touch on really quickly, we have affordable housing projects which touch on all three levels of government. One specifically in the city of Toronto with open door funding, Infrastructure Ontario support, CMHC RCFI funding, and very similar to Andrew, it's actually the same program. All of our rentals in that category have AMR from 40% AMR to 100% AMR. So I just wanted to touch on what Mark said and a couple of things that we're seeing in the market. No news to anyone, hopefully. We are in a housing crisis. From ULI on the Q3 report 2022, there's a 1.2% vacancy rate in GTA. And this is crazy, 72% decline in rental housing starts from this time last year. That's thanks to Urbanation for the stats. So throughout the panel here, I just want to talk about the disconnect here between what's going on in terms of supply and actual immigration. So on the left, we have, what I just said, the uneconomical rental projects being scrapped. Generally, the state of rental right now is the opposite of thriving. But in the same week, an article got released Canada to welcome 500,000 immigrants per year, which is fantastic and something we should be doing, and I feel strongly about as a nation. But there's a complete disconnect between inviting people and making sure that they have homes to live in. So my parents came in the 70s when vacancy was about 8.6%. That was a great landing for them from a different country. Now we're welcoming people into the GTA with a vacancy rate of less than 2%, which is just very disingenuous to welcome people into the country that way. There's just no disconnect. So imagine having a party and having one person with the invite list and one person in the venue, and they don't talk to each other. So somebody invites 700 people and the other person decides to have this party in their one-bedroom apartment. People are going to have to wait outside. And that is what's happening now. People are waiting outside for housing because there is no flow through between setting a target and making sure at the feds, the municipal and the provincial level, that target immigration population have homes. Next. Just to give a quick overview on the problem here, it takes about 6 years to develop an asset, from putting in an application to handing the keys over. That's on really a good day, or a good half decade, let's say. So what I did here is, started a chart at 2016. I zeroed everything out, and then we figured out how do things grow in a 6-year cycle. So on red, you'll see the condo appreciation has grown about 86% since 2016. So they've been able to absorb a lot of the increases you see in blue. So blue is construction. And you see construction costs simply up 64% since 2016. Now, rental is super interesting within this graph. So you see that it's starting to grow from 2016, a little bit in 17, and then a big jump in 18. So there's a couple, I'd say a handful of rental projects that have been delivered into Toronto around this bubble time when things were good. Just as things were starting to peak above construction, you had viable economic rental projects. But then it kind of flatlined during COVID and then went down. And this is one of the things I just want to address really quickly. When you see in the papers that like rental rates are rising, what I hear from government and others are that, well, the rental rates, they're rising, so we're going to grow our way out of this problem. Well, first, they're not rising. They took more than a bit of a dip in 2021, and now we're on our way back, which is not a net new rising. And then if you go to the next slide, the other compounding factor, interest rates are up 600% to nobody's surprise. I actually had to map the yellow on the axis to the right, because it clearly didn't fit with the chart. So it's a double axis chart. Take home message, yellow is wild, 600% increase, and how to cope with that. Next. So one thing real quick, here's what happens when people say, okay, we can just grow our way. The rents can grow our way out of this problem. So let's look at where we are today. Average square foot, 2-bedroom, 700 square foot, City of Toronto, $2,700. I'm just under $4 a foot. So what we would need to do to make this economical, to grow the rents to a point where you've reached the absolute minimum of project viability, that same unit would need to go for over $4,000. At that point, you kind of have a project that is starting to work. So that's just under $6 a foot. And when you go to the next slide, you just see how insane that idea is. So we're starting off with something that today is taking just under 40% of median income. to grow our way out of the problem, that would take 60% of someone's income. So it's just not an option when we hear, yeah, you'll just grow your way to the problem. We're not. So that's how I'm going to set up my questions. Thank you, Mark, for the indulgence.
No problem, and thank you for those slides. I think it clearly shows where government-supported affordable housing is needed and how far up the income spectrum now some degree of government supports are going to be required. Joining us from Ottawa today with sort of a more national perspective or an Ontario-wide perspective on government-supported affordable rental housing is Ray Sullivan. Ray is the interim executive director of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. Ray, can you tell us a little bit about your organization, the kinds of government-supported affordable rental housing you work with, and maybe some examples in the GTA?
Yeah, happy to, and thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, Joe, for painting that picture, that disconnect. And this is a lot of what we do at the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, is try to work with the federal government to connect those dots. And CHRA, and I should say I am in Ottawa, as Mark said, on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And we are the national voice of affordable housing at CHRA. We're a membership-based association. We represent nonprofits and others who are working to make sure that everyone has a decent home that they can afford. Very much that pink and orange side of the spectrum from Mark's chart earlier. And our members' success is our success, and they are literally saving people's lives every day. So I went into our database for folks who might not be familiar with CHRA to look up some of our Toronto-based members that you might be familiar with. It includes a whole lot of folks, but folks like Covenant House, Habitat GTA, House Lincoln Mainstay, the City of Toronto itself, of course, Toronto Community Housing. And this one surprised me, a pleasant surprise. The Entertainment District BIA is a member of CHRA as well. And for myself, more than 20 years in developing and managing nonprofit housing, I've always enjoyed the opportunity to learn, especially from folks who are very active in the private sector. So looking forward to being part of this panel.
Excellent, thank you. And not to digress too much, but there was recently an article in the Toronto Star on it's hard for the entertainment district to attract like actors and musicians to come and be in shows in Toronto because the gap between equity, union rates for being on stage and cost of housing is just so disconnected now in the entertainment district.
And every business needs to think about where their workforce is going to live.
Yeah, and that's sort of where the workforce housing phrasing came from. And Toronto Board of Trade has been doing a lot of work around that workforce housing definition and advocacy. So I'm going to go on to our next question, and starting with Shi, which specific government support programs have you access to create or maintain affordable rental housing, and how well have they worked for you? And what's the value of those been to your Kensington Market Community Land Trust?
I suspect my answer is the greatest outlier. So I'll start by saying that we receive a transformative amount of operational funding from a group most known to the nonprofit and non-market housing sector. CMHC has an arm called Community Housing Transformation Sector. And this has been a critical and deeply needed funder for our work, in the sense that they seem to be one of the funding arms that is the most focused on permanently affordable approaches. And then in 2021, to say specifically in relation to a specific site and project, as an example, we acquired that first property with 50% of the equity coming straight from the City of Toronto. And that money the City of Toronto was able to attain through community benefits charges that is dedicated ward by ward. And so Kensington Market happens to share a ward with University Rosedale. And that is how disparate, the ward system has landed us. So this allowed us to preserve 12 deeply affordable residential units that were explicitly slated by the seller for renovictions and conversions into over 250%, 300% AMR rental rates, when the existing tenants were paying $400 a month in rent in the downtown core in Kensington Market. So based on this acquisition partnership and a previous acquisition with our sister organization that they piloted to acquire a rooming house in Parkdale, the City of Toronto then formalized this type of partnership, and now the program is called the Multi-Unit Residential Acquisition Program. So it's a combination of the MURA program, as we would shorten it, and Open Door funding and some of the mechanisms through Open Door that give us property tax relief, et cetera, in order to operate the building long term, that make this project viable. And that program sort of has a broader advocacy intention to it. It is also the City of Toronto's Housing Secretariat trying to demonstrate to other Ontario municipalities municipalities and other levels of government of how they can simultaneously address both the loss and hemorrhage of existing affordable units while advocating for the creation of new housing stock as well, which is an interest that Ray and I both share. Yeah.
Excellent. Andrew, I'm going to go to you next with the same question. Which government programs have you accessed recently to create affordable rental? Which levels of government provided those supports? I think there were some different levels you were talking about. And what's the value of those supports been to your project, be they financial, logistical?
Mm-hmm. You know, in many ways, I think the most relevant word in your question is recent. You know, in 2018, Tricon, along with Kilmer and Dream, were selected by the province to build over 2,500 units in the West Don lands immediately beside the Distillery District. And we're very proud that all of those projects are all under construction right now. You know, 2018, important year. Construction costs were at a certain level, interest rates were at a certain level, rents were at a certain level. So the stars all aligned. And so that project, you know, the province contributed the land. The City of Toronto, through its Open Door program, helped provide financial support to the affordable units. And then CMHC's RCFI program played a significant role. And so, you know, we're very excited to be welcoming our first residents to Block 8, which is 660 units that will be coming online in Q1 of next year, of which 30% of the units are affordable, and, you know, subsequent additional blocks are in advanced stages of construction, will, you know, deliver in subsequent years. So this is a really good news story, and I think it shows the power of all three levels of government working with the private sector. But, you know, there's a specific set of facts and economic outcomes that need to align to make that happen. You know, our sites as well, in some instances, benefited from existing zoning, and you know, Joe was part of the similar program, and I'll let him tell the story, but he didn't benefit from a zoned site that allowed him to go so quickly. And so he was not able to get started in 2018, and I'm sure he'll talk about the implication of that. You know, Tricon and Kilmer were selected last year by the city to be a partner in another large-scale mixed income market and affordable project. And you know, I would say the set of government sort of preconditions were similar to the 2018 ones. And I think, unfortunately, with the confluence of costs, rates, you know, rents taking a huge dip during COVID and really only starting to see, you know, response now, you know, I think there's a lot of projects facing, you know, pretty severe headwinds. And so there is a significant number of conversations going on with each one of those, you know, government constituencies to do their part. And, you know, I think one thing that's important to note is not one level of government can solve this. The budget gap on these projects are big. Even if one government said, you know, we'll reduce all our levies, that probably wouldn't make the project viable. So it tends to need to be, you know, municipality does X, province does Y, feds do, you know, Z, and if you don't get those three, it's not going to work. And so at this time, what's important is all three levels of government talk, communicate, and are willing to lead from the front, instead of saying, you know, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? Because you know, one group won't be able to solve this.
Okay, I'm going to pass this one over to Ray as well. Some examples of government support programs that you've accessed. What are the value of support, and how is it in an Ontario or Toronto context?
Yeah, and you know, and our members are definitely accessing a lot of the programs specifically designed for non-market housing, Rapid Housing Initiative, Co-Investment Fund. I myself, in a past role, I think I was the first nonprofit to access the Rental Construction Financing Initiative. And what these do is these programs fill a gap. The problem we have in nonprofit sectors, we don't have very much equity at all, right? So you can either replace that equity with government grants or some of these programs. You can reduce the need for equity with ultra low borrowing rates. That alone doesn't deliver particularly deep levels of affordability. So our members are also going after, you know, as Cheese talked about, programs from municipal governments, programs from provincial governments. Not a lot on the table in Ontario right now for us in that respect. But the really big challenge with this is not only, as you know, as Andrew outlined, the way that things have shifted radically in the past 3 years in terms of the economic landscape. And you're absolutely right that not only it's not one level of government alone that's going to be able to solve this, but the private and nonprofit sector are both going to be needed to seriously address this. And part of that involves the difficult risk position that nonprofit operators are in, especially not having very, very deep pockets. And I remember, you know, years ago when CMHC was launching some of these programs, they would proudly crow, they say, we'll underwrite your project to a debt coverage ratio of 1.0 at like historic low interest rates. We're like, well, that's not a good thing. That's actually transferring risk to a nonprofit operator. That's a bad thing, you know, and 6 or 7 years from now, there's going to be a whole lot of projects that are going to be noticing that. What I would love to see is for CMHC and other governments to sit down with both private and nonprofit expertise, the folks who have the boots on the ground, to co-design and even co-deliver some of these programs so they can adapt to what it is we need, rather than having government guess what it is that's going to make the difference. Sit down with us and we'll tell you what'll make the difference.
Thanks, Ray. So, Joe, I'm going to come to you, but I'm actually going to kind of combine this question and the next one. What are the supports you've received? What are your successes? But also, to Ray's point, what are the challenges you have in dealing with the different levels of government? You know, do you have challenges with program restrictions, program access, application processes, the speed of government processes versus the speed you guys would like to be moving at? Anything in that spectrum?
Yeah, Andrew has me very nostalgic for 2018. There's an office quote that I quote often. It's, I wish there was a way to know you're in the good old days before you've actually left them. 2018 was great, but we are not in 2018 anymore. So a little bit of a different story. Started in the same place in Andrew, but our application for our project that has 3 levels of government cooperation, 30% affordable housing, we needed a rezoning. So instead of being a shovel ready in 2018, when the economics lined up and we would have been in the same position as Andrew in delivering these units, we had to go through rezoning. Bit of a challenge in rezoning, as we know, took a little bit of time. And unfortunately, in the middle of zoning and toward the end, we ended up in an economic cycle that this project just doesn't make sense in. So that's kind of our process. The city's open door was great. I think the future of these is there's a bit of a disconnect between counting affordable housing and actually counting affordable housing that's been delivered. So like when you look at a CMHC checklist, like RCFI, great. Our project is in RCFI. Our project is in Open Doors. Our project is in the provincial PALP, which is provincial
Affordable Housing
Land. Thank you. Okay, I had it in my notes, but thank you. Okay, all good.
Acronym man.
Thank you. So like we're in all of those programs, and when you look at the reports, there you see a lot of houses on paper, you know, supposed to be coming online. But what the challenge is now in 2022, where we are with the economy, is how do you actually recalibrate those programs to make sense in 2022? And to me, that's the entire thing. Is we had success in 2018. Those of us that were able to build, and now those units are being handed over. How do we make that same successful outcome in 2022? You have to recalibrate the programs. So to go on my experience a little bit, the city has been great in sitting down saying, I know things have changed. So that's the first recognition. The province has been really good saying, I know things have changed. Out of the 3, those are really the only 2 that have an honest recognition of, I know things have changed and I can help. So the challenge with us, and I think the industry, is CMHC has not kept up their underwriting standards. So what made sense in 2018, 2019, the program has simply not been updated to include today's interest rate. It is administered as if you were in 2019. And when you take the result of that administration, it doesn't work. So until there's a recognition that we're not in 2018 anymore at the federal level, it's not going to work. So my whole thing is recalibration of existing programs. We don't need new ideas. We don't need new programs. We just need to input today's economics into the programs that already exist. And again, city, province have been great at that.
You're asking the government program to be nimble, Joe? Is that what you're asking for?
Perhaps not nimble, but like between 2019 and 2020, you had 3 years to, keep up with the change. So
Okay, so I wanted to come back to Chi Yi on this one. Particularly, my understanding is that Kensington Market Community Land Trust is so new. What have been your challenges with engaging with the different levels of government and government programs as a new grassroots, ground up organization entering into the affordable housing rental space?
Yeah, I'm struggling with that and also juggling like really wanting to respond to Joe directly.
Go ahead, respond to Joe directly. That's what we're here for.
I mean, like, okay, so this nostalgia for 2018 would be deeply insulting to my community members, right? Because like to them, it's like we're operating in this entirely alternate world where why would there be a baseline profit assumption in the numbers to make a project work in the first place? I understand that we're like operating in entirely different sectors, and of course that's not a fair, like totally fair. That is the nature of your job. But like it just feels like if we are going to be advocating towards government in general, then we have to like not narrow this conversation to the base assumption that only the private sector develops and constructs housing, right? Like they're like the private sector should not be standing on its own. There should be a significant and interesting for like all of us in our careers, diverse market that is non-market to not just nonprofits, but also like co-ops and unions and like women's associations that historically have housed people broadly that are like federally funded and provincially funded to like an interesting and significant degree. And if it was true that demand and supply in the market actually were the things that dictated whether or not projects were going ahead, then things would still be built. But the truth is that interest rates are what actually dictates it. And like a basic policy analysis would make it really clear that like it's this like false assumption that if we were to focus on just how to actually deliver this amount of units without questioning where those units come from, who is operating them, and are they permanently affordable units, then like we would, in other words, like I feel like Joel Roberts would say, like if prices were being driven by truly a lack of supply and nothing else, and not the capacity to take on debt and speculation, then interest rates wouldn't be having this effect at all on the level of construction, right? If we were honest with ourselves. Anyway, to actually answer the question though, from the grassroots perspective, I think this will be interesting for some people. So like the scale of like of rents rising that Joel also showed, like that's a graph that only shows the last 5 years, right? If you look at the scale of it, in the broad sense, like Torontonians have been like 2018 was one of the highest years for just like evictions and people dying on the street. So due to the nature of our very unique solution, actually surprisingly, I feel like the funding we have accessed has been incredibly nimble, really fast and easy, like flexible to access, which I think is surprising.
Put in a good word for us.
Yeah. Like it's been really surprising, but I think it's because it's the nature of my project, as opposed to the numbers that you guys are bringing forward.
And was that rapid housing?
I would like step back and say that the main limitation in accessing government support is that we just like aren't thinking on the level of transformative investments that were present decades ago, like before my lifetime, right? Like the kinds of the sheer amount of investments and cooperative units and nonprofit units and non-market sector that we were building, like public housing. I'm talking about structural care. There's never been such a dry spell. And there's like this generational amnesia that I want to describe, also because I've like been able to operate not just in the Canadian sector, that's incredibly narrow and limited. Like you could look to any other country and realize that there has never, like I've never seen a housing market that has such a disproportionate reliance on just the for-profit private sector to develop these units. It's like, this is deeply abnormal. Less than 5% of Canada's like housing units I've heard are non-market units. In Austria, it's like 60%, and my rents would be $500 a month, right? Euros. And that's a proportion that truly, finally, has like a substantive effect on the overall housing submarket in Canada. But I feel like the conversations get really into the weeds, and we never actually step back and like look at like Joel, like people like Joe and Andrew should not be like operating in this like weird silo where the entire burden of delivering all of this is just on their one sector. Like that would be so narrow of us to frame it like that.
Okay, I'm getting some nods out of Ray. So Ray, I'm going to give you like 30 seconds to jump in on team not-for-profit housing here.
Yeah, thank you so much, GE, for bringing that up. This is exactly what I've been thinking. Joe, it goes beyond recalibrating these kinds of programs, right? I mean, the ground has shifted enough, and you're absolutely right. If we look back 25, 30 years, the level of investments, the kind of restraints that are artificially put on what government and non-market players can do now didn't seem to be an obstacle back then. And I think we need to draw on the expertise and the capacity of the private sector. We need to reimagine what housing can look like.
Okay, I'm going to go to Andrew to speak to, you can either choose to speak to the topics that have just been raised, or you can speak to the challenges that you have had in interacting with some of these programs, similar to Joe's, different from Joe's.
Yeah, I mean, again, I want to make the point, one of these can't fix it alone. So even if, we went with Joe's, perspective on some of the CMHC challenges, in my personal opinion, all they can do is change the capital stack. It doesn't, in the amount of debt and equity, it doesn't change that the yield on cost from a, operating income divided by cost perspective is under pressure in these. So I in many ways, actually, I've had maybe more of a in-between experience between Chi and Joe. I found CMHC to be responsive and proactive. Where I have personally found challenges, and I share this often, is when I make presentations to government, I'm typically, and sorry, Chi, to keep going back to periods of time, but I often give the same presentation today that I gave in 2016 and 17 about, if we are truly trying to catalyze more rental housing, which is a stated goal of all three levels of government for the City of Toronto's housing plan, the province's More Homes, More Choice plan, the National Housing Strategy, why are we taxing this at about 25% of project budgets? That is a huge needle mover on project viability. And the folks who can solve that are more at the municipal and provincial level. And they know this. They've heard this for 7-8 years now. Where I find the challenge arises is there's no shortage of enthusiasm by the executives in City Hall and the Premier's office and the like. But in terms of actually taking ideas and shifting those to action that moves the needle on project viability, it's been elusive. And so I think it's follow through. They know, people know what the needles are. It's development charges, it's HST at the municipal and provincial level. And I think seeing change there will unlock a significant amount of new supply.
So, and in both of the projects that Andrew and Joe that you spoke about, you did say there were some 40% AMR units in these, but my assumption is that is 3% of the overall units in the building, maybe even less. Like what sort of if I'm building 1,000 units in one of these big,
And also for how many years?
and for how many years? What sort of range are you creating?
So our projects, it's 100 years of affordability. And with respect to your question, I think what's unique about the projects that Joe and I are involved in is the model is creating a thriving, complete community where all units are finished to the same standard. Units are randomly distributed throughout the communities. Everyone gets access to the same amenities, service, whether it's mobile apps or resident programming, community events, and the like. You don't know who lives behind the door, and that's by design. And so for these communities, and candidly, like this is a model that was borrowed from the US. It was set by our governments. They dictate the AMR levels. And again, in the spirit of creating a thriving, complete community, it's not by design about people on spectrums. And so, by and large, Mark, you're right. It has a higher AMR focus, but again, the spirit of it is providing workforce housing for, hospitality workers, first responders, nurses, teachers, the backbone of our city. And to borrow what she said earlier, this is not an or concept, it's an and concept. And there's absolutely a need for more affordable housing that's focused on the lower end of the spectrum. Many constituents in those cohorts are looking for more supportive environments. They don't want to live in the buildings that I was articulating. They want more, people tend to want to be clustered in one space. They want more supportive resources in that building. We have lots of conversations with the not-for-profits in our integrated communities, and that's their expressed view. So it's absolutely an and concept. I think what Chi is referencing is critically important, and I think for what Joe and I are doing, creating these thriving complete communities, there's also a need there, and the AMR levels are different.
Excellent. All right. We're down to the last 15 minutes here, and I want to get through all these questions. So I'm going to ask all of you in these next sort of rounds of questions to try and keep it to a minute or so in your responses, so we can try and get through all the content and we can hear everybody's voice again. So I want to go to Ray, and Ray, your overall impression of the rapid housing strategy and the national housing strategy, the federal national housing strategy, the rapid housing portion of it, rental construction finance, other components of it. If you can give us 90 seconds.
In 90 seconds.
In 90 seconds.
So look, I don't want to understate the national housing strategy was a big deal, and seeing the federal government come into particularly non-market housing was a huge step, and it's a pretty big price tag attached to it. Not that everything was perfect, and the CMHC staff that I've worked have always been open to trying to get things right and trying to improve them. But we've had a sea change in the past 3 years, and it's not a question of tinkering with those programs anymore. There needs to be a reset on the national housing strategy. In 2017, the national housing strategy focused very much on the non-market community housing side of things. And then 2021, government is scrambling to come up with measures and regulations that will also address the housing crisis as it inches up the income spectrum toward market-based housing as well. Those things should all have been to the same well thought out. It's part of an economic strategy. This isn't just a social service strategy. This is an economic strategy that is a fundamental driver. As Joe mentioned really eloquently at the opening, this is part of our immigration and population growth strategy. This is part of how cities grow. This is part of who we are as Canadians, and it needs to be revisited now, because yesterday it's too late.
Okay, Joe, to you, another quick response on on the national housing strategy and what you like, what your challenges are.
Same thing as Ray. It was a big deal, and I just want to make the point that it did work. Like, there was a time where it was a very helpful tool to deliver. You could set your sites and use it to deliver housing. I use the word recalibrate. I thought I was being polite. I've heard much worse things here, but I'll go back to my recalibrate. It could be an effective tool if it was updated, to be put politely. Thank you, Ray. Okay,
Xi, do you want to speak briefly to national housing strategy, the rapid housing, which I think funded some of yours, and what your current take on it? Are we on the right track or the wrong track? I think wrong track.
I think we're entirely on the wrong track. And I will say that the simple, succinct way of saying why is that, yes, the national housing strategy was an ECDEV strategy, but there was this conflation of all ECDEV strategies being the same. And it is entirely different for an ECDEV strategy to be housing as a human right, and so it meets like a basic human need, and people have shelter and can focus their attention and economic activity towards doing other things, getting jobs, versus an ECDEV strategy as homeownership and housing as a financial asset that people are investing in as their retirement funds, as an over-relied on investment vehicle. Housing is fundamentally an investment in Canada, which is not going to create a functional society. This is like a deep, deep ill that no one in this particular room is kind of like contributing to or solving on their own. So from that view, I would say no, it's like incredibly flawed, and we really need to hard rethink how we think about housing.
Okay, Andrew, talk to us very briefly about Housing Now lands. I heard you mention there's some Housing Now land, the provincial affordable housing land program. If there's a federal equivalent to the federal land program, how much does that land provision from government assist the kinds of projects that you're trying to build?
It's a part of the equation. That's one element of a contribution. The other is the open door relief. The other is CMHC. So again, it's all important. It's not, and ultimately, like, we're all solving for the totality of outcome, and all of those inputs matter. You know, you asked this question earlier, like, how's it going? What's the outcome here? I mean, I think, you know, Mayor Tory in 2020, as part of the City of Toronto's like housing TO program, said 40,000 units by 2030, affordable units. And it's really actually 44,000, because 4,000 incremental are supposed to be ownership. If we are not starting, and starting means shovels in the ground. I don't know what this word approval means. They're talking about 40,000 approved units. That's this much of a development process.
Yeah.
Still got to build it and operate it and lease it. Who cares about approvals? That's this much of the equation. We need to be starting, you know, 4,400 units per year to deliver on that promise. And we are a fraction of that. Like, we might be 3,000 to 4,000 units in total over the last, you know, 3 years, where it should be 12 plus, and, you know, nothing's happening right now. So no, we are way off track.
Yeah,
So I think recalibrating is a nice word. We need restart on a lot of these program designs.
and not to talk to the city in particular, but all levels of government, often those targets that are set far in the future. They're kind of New Year's resolutions. I'm going to lose weight and I'm going to go to the gym more, but do you actually lose weight and go to the gym more? Do you put the effort in and put your steps in every day to get to that target that you set for yourself? So we're down to the last 10 minutes here, and I wanted to jump into our speed round and then hand it back over to Richard to see if there's any questions in the Q&A. So we are 1 month from Christmas Eve today. Each of you get to ask Mayor Tory, Premier Ford, and Prime Minister Trudeau for one change or improvement to a government-supported rental housing program at their level of government. What is your dear Santa ask for each of them? So I'm going to start with Ray on this. Ray, for a mayor, what is your dear Santa ask for a mayor, briefly?
I love this, because just this week I've gone on the record as accusing Bill 23 at the provincial level of being a private developer's Christmas wish list. For Mayor Tory, my ask, if I get to sit on his knee, would be figure out a way how to maintain that acquisition program, MURA, that she mentioned, even though Bill 23 has gutted a lot of the funding that actually finances it. For Premier Ford, yes, there needs to be more housing supply. When we're setting targets, think about also targets for community housing supply. As she mentioned, you know, less than 5% of the housing stock across the country is community housing. I think we all agree that there needs to be more of that kind of supportive, nonprofit, mixed income housing. If we're setting a target of 1.5 million new homes in the province, just to maintain the status quo, 75,000 of those have to be community housing. And I think we all agree there needs to be even more than that.
You get like 5 words for your request from Santa Elf Justin Trudeau.
Yes, Indigenous urban housing strategy. And there needs to be a dollar figure attached to that in the 2023 budget, and it needs to have 10 digits.
Okay, Andrew, I'm going to you with your dear Santa asks for the mayor of Toronto.
Very good one so far. One, for Tory, eliminate development charges for market rate units. It makes no sense that we're taxing condo and rental the same when there's a clear goal of more rental. 2, HST that's paid to the province and the city is the biggest government levy. Again, if we're trying to incent more rental, either index the rebate payment from 1991, eliminate it, push it back to the point that the projects are sold, but having to pay, you know, roughly 13% of assessed value at stabilization is a massive drag on these projects and tips viability. And then finally, longer term CMHC financing. I think these projects are incredibly tight out of the gates. And so longer term financing that gives you certainty for a longer period of time to amortize your debt and, you know, grow into your debt service would give, you know, people more confidence. So no DCs for market units, push HST out until projects are sold, and longer term CMHC financing.
Okay,
Okay, I'm going to jump in with the opposite. For
Okay.
Tory, I want him to stop giving away all tax concessions for non-permanent agreements. I want Ford at the provincial level, first of all, to get out of office, but then to distribute massive investments in new affordable housing, build an actual housing program, bigger, better than an arm like BC Housing. For Trudeau, I would want a massive investment to the degree that we saw in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in public housing that well includes beyond an Indigenous housing strategy that has real dollar amounts to it. I got to echo Ray there, until it constitutes over 50% of the Canadian housing stock to actually stabilize this crisis.
Okay, I'm going to add to you just a stat that in the city of Toronto, $1 billion federal dollars gets about 2,100 housing units. So when you say a massive investment, it's really massive. Like we're talking tens of billions of dollars to create the kinds of units you're talking about. And I think politicians are not comfortable talking with that scale of number being dedicated to housing. Joe, your
Christmas
Christmas
was
wish.
a Christmas wish.
It is. No, I'm not.
We're also giving away that many trillions of dollars in taxes lost. So
your Christmas wish list is great. I totally agree with you. I think we wanted to quantify the number on it because that is a number that when we're all of us are talking to politicians, we need to be talking about the billions of dollars of investment. Joe, you want to do your Christmas wish list for Mayor Tory, Premier Ford, and Prime Minister Trudeau?
You know what? I'll have the same, in interest of time, it's the same wish. Let's get together, talk about and ensure that the amount of immigration that we're bringing in matches a very defined business plan to deliver that many units. Within that, you'll see that spectrum should include Ray, Gigi, Andrew, myself. Like within that 500,000, there's a bunch of different strategies, do not disagree, but to completely, allow people in and not have houses for them is just a complete atrocity for our country. And then like my parents are immigrants, this is not the country they came to. So I'd hate for my children and the next generation of immigrants to have a much different Canadian lifestyle than I've enjoyed. So housing has to be up front. You cannot announce 500,000 people without having 500,000 homes. So that's it for me. Match the immigration to the supply and using all of us. There's many different ways to get affordable housing in different levels, and we're all here.
So
Or match the supply to the immigration and have high targets for both.
Absolutely, 100%.
We've got 3 minutes left. I'm going to get one question from the audience. And I just want to point out that somebody said, this is not a question, but they'd like to say how much they enjoyed Chi being on the panel. Chi and Ray bring a very refreshing discourse to the conversation. We should do this in person at the spring meeting next year. If we don't do it in a panel, we should do it in the bar at the hotel, if nothing else. All right, so one question here. For Joe and Andrew, have you explored partnerships with nonprofit operators to deliver affordable units in the past? That would be operated and managed by nonprofits. Example, Gila from Daniels spoke to projects with Wood Green, L'Arche, and other nonprofits. You've each got 1 minute.
For the projects we do, as I said earlier, it's an integrated housing model where everyone is treated equally. And so it's one management model for the entire community. We work with many not-for-profits from, Single Mothers, Wood Green, Interval House, Arts and Culture, Artscape, Performing Arts Lodge, Costi with Newcomers to Canada, a long list. We take a single operational approach. So all units are managed, by Tricon as the single operator. Again, for Daniels, who tends to build more segmented housing where it's a single block allocated to a single not-for-profit, I think that model can work, but we're doing something different.
Okay, let me flip that question really quickly because we're down to the last 2 minutes.
Yep.
To Ray and to Chi, would you be interested in partnering with people like Choice and Tricon on some of their opportunities?
Yes.
Unfortunately, I'm beholden to a democratic ownership model, so there's no room for it.
There's don't need to apologize for that. It's all part of the spectrum. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Richard and really thank this panel. It's been a great hour. We could have done another hour, I think.
Indeed, we could. And I also want to thank the panel, Mark, starting with you for wrangling a lot of conversation and a lot of disparate perspectives up until today and including today. I agree with the comment about G and Ray being on our panel. And frankly, I'd like to say it publicly right now. I hope that you will both allow us to do a deeper dive in your part of the equation, because I think we need to do much more discussion in that space than we've allowed for today. Andrew and Joe have been fantastic contributors both on this panel and in broader work that we do around affordability with ULI. I can't thank them enough. So thank you. And it's 1 o'clock. We always end on time. You've probably hopefully seen some of the upcoming events that we have on the screen. We'll look forward to seeing you, if not tomorrow, very, very soon. All the best. Bye-bye.